Picture building $100 million company from a garage with your bare hands, and then watching federal agents march through your own lobby to arrest you for it. For Elijah Vance, 42 years old and a single father to a 14-year-old girl who was waiting at home for dinner, that nightmare was happening right now in broad daylight, in front of every employee he had ever hired. And the woman leading the arrest was about to freeze the instant she saw his face. Welcome back to the channel. If you've ever had someone misjudge you completely, and then watch the truth come out anyway, stay with this one to the end. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from today. 19 years ago, Vance Logistics was 3 folding tables in a rented garage, and Elijah was the only employee, driving his own beat-up pickup for deliveries because he couldn't afford a fleet. He built the company one contract at a time, one promise kept at a time, until it became the kind of place where warehouse workers stayed a decade and executives turned down bigger salaries elsewhere just to keep working for him. Richard Sterling had come on as CFO 8 years in, right as the company scaled past anything Elijah could manage alone, and for a long time Elijah had counted him among the few people who understood the business as deeply as he did. The raid hit Vance Logistics at 4:40 in the afternoon, right as the building was starting to empty out for the day. 6 federal agents moved through the glass-walled executive floor with the kind of clipped efficiency that told everyone this had been planned for weeks. Elijah didn't fight them. He stood by his own desk, arms pulled behind his back, and let the cold metal bite into his wrists while his mind raced through every ledger, every wire transfer, every signature he had ever put on a company document, searching for the mistake that could possibly explain this. He came up empty, because there wasn't one. Not one that was his. Out past the glass wall, his employees had stopped moving entirely. Some had their phones half-raised, unsure if filming was the right thing to do. Others just stood there, hands over their mouths, watching a man who had personally paid 2 employees' rent during a rough winter get walked out in handcuffs like a stranger. Elijah wasn't just their boss. He was the reason half of them still had health insurance during the years the company barely broke even. His phone buzzed once against the desk before an agent swept it into an evidence bag. He caught half a glance at the screen. Maya. Dad. Are you almost done? I'm starving, lol. He didn't get to answer it. Near the doorway, Richard stood with his arms folded, calm in a way that struck Elijah as strange even through the fog of everything happening. While 2 junior staffers stood frozen with fear, Richard moved among them, murmuring that everyone should cooperate fully, hand over whatever records were requested, and let the process play out quietly. It would go easier for the company that way, he said, easier for all of them. At the time, it read as a steady hand in a crisis. Elijah wouldn't understand until much later exactly how carefully that steadiness had been rehearsed. Prosecutor Lauren Hayes walked in at 4:52, 11 minutes after the arrest began, carrying the kind of reputation that made defense attorneys request settlement talks before she'd even opened her file. She crossed the room reading the warrant, not looking up, checking names against faces the way she'd done 100 times before. Then she looked up. The room didn't go quiet because anyone told it to. It went quiet because Lauren Hayes, a woman who had sent 3 separate CFOs to federal prison without blinking, stood frozen in the middle of an arrest she was supposed to be running. Mom. The lead agent, a broad-shouldered man named Reynolds, glanced at her sideways. Everything all right? She didn't answer him. Her eyes were locked on the small white scar above Elijah's left eyebrow, the one he'd gotten falling off his bike outside a campus library 20 years ago, the one she used to trace with her thumb while they studied for exams neither of them could afford to fail. Elijah! The word came out unsteady, nothing like the courtroom voice she'd built her career on. He lifted his head. It took him a second, the tailored suit, the federal badge, the 20 years, but then it clicked into place, and for just a moment neither of them was standing in a room full of federal agents at all. Lauren! His voice cracked on her name. Lauren Miller? Reynolds stepped between them, all business. "Ma'am, the warrant's executed. We need to transport the suspect." "Give me a minute, Agent Reynolds." Lauren's hand came up, but her authority in this moment wasn't as absolute as it looked. This wasn't her case file. She wasn't the one who'd built it. She was here to oversee the execution of somebody else's warrant, and that meant she didn't have the standing to simply order him released. Not yet, not without cause on paper. "I know this looks bad," Elijah said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I swear to you on my daughter's life, I never touched a dishonest dollar in this company. Someone forged my signature." "We'll sort it out," Lauren said, and even as she said it, she hated how thin it sounded against the sight of him in cuffs. "I'm going to look into every piece of this myself. I promise you that." "Ma'am, we really do need to move him," Reynolds said, not unkindly. "I can't hold federal transport on a personal matter." There was nothing she could do about that. Not standing in this room, not with a signed indictment already on file. She watched them walk him toward the elevator, watched him glance back once, and felt something in her chest twist tight enough to steal her breath. If you've ever felt completely powerless to help someone you cared about, hit that like button right now, because this is about to get a lot harder before it gets better. Elijah spent that night in a federal holding facility 2 hours from home. They took his fingerprints, his photograph, his belt, and his shoelaces, and told him he'd get one phone call sometime before morning. It never came. He sat on a metal bench in a room that smelled like bleach and old coffee, replaying the last thing his daughter had texted him and knowing she had no idea where he was. Back at the house, Maya tried his phone 4 times before dinner, 5 more times after. By 8 o'clock the calls were going straight to voicemail, and by 9 she was standing barefoot on the porch in the cold, dialing the only other number she had memorized, sobbing before Mrs. Alvarez next door even finished saying hello. Mrs. Alvarez came over in her robe, sat with her at the kitchen table, and told her everything was going to be fine in the calm, practiced voice adults use when they have no idea whether that's true. Maya didn't sleep that night either. She sat curled on the couch with her father's spare jacket over her knees, watching the driveway. Lauren didn't sleep either. She drove straight back to her office and pulled every document connected to the Vance logistics investigation, spreading them across her desk like she was trying to physically hold the case together with her hands. The official file said the probe had started with an anonymous tip to the Inspector General, backed by records of offshore transfers running through accounts under Elijah's name. On paper, it looked airtight. She knew airtight cases. She also knew that airtight and true weren't always the same thing. She read every wire authorization twice. Then a third time, somewhere around 1 in the morning, her eyes caught on something small enough that a less careful prosecutor would have scrolled right past it. A digital stamp on one authorization form listing a middle initial of R. Elijah's middle name was Joseph. She sat up straight, heart hammering, and pulled the executive directory for Vance Logistics. Her finger stopped on one name near the top: Richard Sterling, Chief Financial Officer. A man with full access to the company's internal banking systems, full authority to move money in Elijah's name, and she remembered now from a single comment Elijah had made in the chaos of the raid. A man who'd stood conveniently close to the door when the agents arrived, telling everyone to cooperate fully and not ask questions, that it would go easier for the company that way. At the time, it had sounded like loyalty. Now it sounded like something else entirely. By 7 the next morning, Lauren was standing in front of her supervising attorney's desk, arguing for emergency review of the arrest based on a documented forensic discrepancy. It took 2 hours, a formal motion, and a promise to personally take custody of the investigation before a judge signed off on Elijah's release pending further review. It wasn't the clean, instant rescue she wanted to give him, but it was real, and by 9 that morning, she was the one standing outside the holding facility when they finally walked him out into the daylight. He looked wrecked, unshaven, hollow-eyed, wrists still faintly marked from the cuffs. and when he saw her waiting there, something in his face broke open with relief. "You came," he said. "I told you I would." She didn't reach for a handshake. She pulled him into a hug instead, and he let her, standing there on the sidewalk holding on to the first person in 20 years who'd looked at him and simply believed him. She drove him home herself. Maya threw open the front door before the car had even fully stopped, and the sight of his daughter running down the driveway in her socks undid Elijah completely. He dropped to one knee on the pavement and held her so tight she laughed and complained she couldn't breathe, and for the first time in 18 hours Elijah let himself cry. "I called you like 100 times," Maya said into his shoulder, her voice thick. "I thought something happened to you." "I know, sweetheart. I know."
I'm sorry.
He pulled back just enough to look at her face, brushing a tear off her cheek with his thumb. "I'm not going anywhere. I promise you that." Behind them, Lauren stood by the car, giving them the moment, until Maya broke away from her father and hugged her too, fierce and unprompted, murmuring a thank you into her coat that Lauren would remember for a long time after. 2 days later, once he'd showered, slept, and started to look like himself again, Lauren met him at a quiet diner on the edge of the city to lay out what she'd found. Rain tapped against the window. She slid a folder across the table. "Whoever set you up made one mistake," she said. "They used your authority code, but the system logged Richard's personal registry number on the same transaction. He didn't just frame you, Elijah. He's been stealing from your company for months, and he needed you gone before anyone came looking." Elijah stared at the pages, jaw tight. "I trusted him for 8 years. He came to Thanksgiving." "People can hide a lot behind a dinner table," Lauren said. "But you're not carrying this alone anymore." "Why are you doing all this?" he asked. "You could lose your career over pulling threads outside your assigned case." She looked down at the folder, then back up at him. "Because 20 years ago, when I couldn't afford a textbook or a decent meal, you were the only person who noticed. I never forgot that. I wasn't about to let you go down for something you didn't do." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Why did you never tell me you'd made Prosecutor? I would have shown up to every single trial." "I looked you up once," she admitted. "Years ago. Saw a photo of you cutting a ribbon on some community shelter you'd funded, and I almost called the number on the press release just to say congratulations. I chickened out." "I looked for you too," he said. "Every legal journal that came across my desk, I checked the byline first." "We were both idiots," she said, laughing despite everything. "We were 22 and broke," he said. "I think that's a pretty good excuse." Neither of them said anything else for a while. They didn't have to. 3 days after that, Lauren set the trap. She summoned Richard Sterling to the federal courthouse under the pretense of finalizing the asset review on Vance Logistics. And he walked in wearing a $2,000 suit and the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. He stopped short in the doorway when he saw Elijah standing beside her. "What is he doing here?" Richard's voice sharpened instantly. "He's supposed to be in federal custody." "Sit down, Mr. Sterling," Lauren said evenly. "I don't answer to you outside a courtroom." He didn't sit. "If Vance is interfering with a federal case, I want it on record." "It's already on record," Lauren said, and slid a single page across the table. "Your personal digital signature key is attached to 11 offshore transfers totaling $30 million. I'd like you to explain that." Richard barely glanced at it. "That's absurd. If my credentials show up anywhere near those accounts, it's because Elijah cloned them to build a case against me. I've seen this play before. Desperate man, desperate accusations." "Funny," Elijah said quietly, "because I didn't even know those accounts existed until 3 days ago. You expect a judge to take his word over 8 years of clean audits?" Richard's eyes cut to Lauren. "And you, I know exactly what this is. You and Vance have history. Everyone at that raid saw you fall apart the second you recognized him. You want to talk about what's on record? Your personal relationship with the defendant is a conflict of interest that's going to blow this whole case apart the second I mention it to a judge. For a second, the threat landed. Lauren's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. Go ahead and mention it. Every finding in this file was independently verified by forensic auditors who've never met either of us. You're not threatening my case, Richard. You're stalling. Richard's composure slipped for the first time, just slightly, a flicker behind his eyes. You have nothing, he said, but his voice had lost its edge. I have transaction logs from 3 Swiss intermediary banks, Lauren said, sliding a second folder across the table. I have your registry number on the falsified authorization, and I have a witness statement from your own assistant, who confirms you asked her to shred a set of internal transfer records the same week the anonymous tip landed with the Inspector General. Richard's face went pale. He glanced at the door, then took a half-step toward it. This meeting is over. I'll have my attorney contact your office. Sit down, Richard, Elijah said, and there was nothing soft in his voice now. You can walk out that door if you want. But there are 2 federal officers standing on the other side of it, and all you'll be doing is making them chase you down a hallway on camera. Richard stopped. For a moment he just stood there, calculating, the confidence draining visibly out of his shoulders. You have no idea what you're doing, he said, quieter now, almost to himself. This company was mine as much as it was ever his. It was never yours, Elijah said. You just decided it should be. It's over, Elijah said again. This time, Richard didn't argue. The federal officers who'd been waiting in the hallway stepped in before Richard could decide whether to run. He didn't say another word as they cuffed him, just stared at Elijah with something between hatred and disbelief, like he genuinely could not understand how the man he'd tried to bury had somehow ended up standing free. When the room emptied out, Elijah turned to Lauren, still catching his breath. You saved my life. My daughter's life. I just followed the evidence, she said softly, and this time she let herself smile. He pulled her into a hug right there in the empty conference room, and for the first time in nearly a week, the weight in his chest finally, fully lifted. But Richard's threat hadn't disappeared with him. It was still sitting out there waiting to be filed, and by the end of the week it would be. Before we continue, if you're the kind of person who believes the truth eventually finds its way to the surface, subscribe and turn on notifications, because Richard Sterling wasn't finished trying to bury it. The morning after the arrest, Elijah walked back into his own lobby for the first time in a week, and the building felt like it belonged to a different company entirely. Employees who'd watched him get handcuffed 6 days earlier now stood near the elevators watching him walk in beside Lauren, who wore a plain gray coat and carried a single slim folder. Like the woman who'd upended the last week of their lives didn't need anything more than that to prove she'd done it properly. He gathered the whole staff in the main auditorium on short notice. His voice shook for the first sentence, then steadied. I know the last few days have been frightening and confusing for everyone in this room, he said. Watching federal agents walk through our office is not something any of us signed up for. But I want you to hear this directly from me. The truth has come out. What happened here was an internal breach by someone we trusted. It was not a failure of this company, and it was not me. He gestured to Lauren. This is Assistant U.S. Attorney Lauren Hayes. She's the reason I'm standing here instead of still sitting in a federal holding cell. Full charges have been filed against our former CFO. And as of this morning, this company is fully cleared. The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was loud, and it went on long enough that Elijah had to hold up a hand to quiet the room, blinking hard against the sting in his eyes. Afterward, a warehouse supervisor named Dennis, who'd worked for Elijah since the garage days, found him by the elevators and shook his hand for a long moment without saying anything at all. "Never doubted you for a second," he finally said, which both of them knew wasn't entirely true, and which Elijah appreciated anyway. Another employee, younger, barely 2 years into the job, admitted she'd already started updating her resume the night of the raid, certain the company was finished. She deleted it on the elevator ride down. That night, he and Lauren sat on his living room couch with a pizza box open between them while Maya worked on a school project at the kitchen table, occasionally shouting facts about the water cycle through the doorway. Lauren leaned back into the cushions and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for a week. "I don't think I've gone a night without a case file open in front of me in 5 years, she said. "Is that a bad thing?" Elijah handed her a napkin. "It's the best thing that's happened to me in 5 years. She looked over at him. "My job puts me around conflict and bitterness constantly. Being here with you and Maya, it feels like something I forgot I was allowed to want." He reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Then let me take care of you for a while. You've spent 20 years fighting for everyone else." "I'd really like that," she said, and rested her head against his shoulder. It didn't last long. For days later, Richard's attorney filed an emergency motion to have Lauren removed from the case entirely, arguing that her prior personal relationship with Elijah tainted the entire investigation from the moment she walked into that raid. It wasn't just a legal maneuver this time. Someone had leaked it to a local news outlet, and by that afternoon there were reporters camped outside the federal courthouse asking questions with cameras rolling. By the time Elijah and Lauren pulled up to the courthouse 2 days later, a small crowd of reporters had already gathered on the steps, cameras angled and waiting. One shouted a question about whether Lauren had compromised a federal case for a college boyfriend before they'd even made it out of the car. Elijah reached over and took her hand before she could open the door. "Don't answer any of it," he said. "Not one word. Let the evidence answer for you." She nodded, jaw set, and they walked through the noise together without stopping, microphones jabbing toward them the entire way up the steps. Worse, the motion didn't stop there. Richard's attorney had also subpoenaed Lauren's personal phone records from the week of the raid, trying to prove she'd coordinated with Elijah before the case was formally reassigned to her. If a judge found even the appearance of impropriety, every piece of evidence she'd gathered, the wire logs, the registry number, all of it, could be thrown out and Richard could walk free on a technicality that had nothing to do with his guilt. Elijah found her in her office early that morning, staring at the motion with a stack of untouched coffee going cold beside her. "They're not just trying to discredit me," she said. "If this works, Richard doesn't just get a mistrial. He gets everything back. The money, the company, all of it." Elijah crossed the room and put both hands on her shoulders. "Then we make sure it doesn't work. You didn't do anything wrong, Lauren. You followed a discrepancy nobody else caught, and the evidence backed you up every step of the way. I know that. I just hate that they're using you to come after me. Let them try." His voice was steady. "We survived worse than this with nothing in our pockets 20 years ago. This isn't going to be what breaks us." That night, after Maya had gone to bed, Lauren sat on the porch steps wrapped in Elijah's jacket, staring at nothing in particular. He sat down beside her without a word. "What if the judge doesn't buy it?" she said quietly. "What if I've spent 20 years building a career and I lose all of it because I couldn't stop myself from caring about you?" "Then we start over," Elijah said. "Together this time instead of 20 years apart. But I don't think it comes to that. You didn't do anything wrong, Lauren. You did the opposite of wrong. Somebody's just trying to make that inconvenient for them." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a long time neither of them said anything else. The porch light buzzed faintly overhead. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and went quiet. The hearing was held 3 days later in a packed courtroom. Lauren stood at the podium and walked the judge through the entire forensic timeline. Not from memory, not from personal conviction, but from 3 independently verified federal audits that had confirmed the falsified signature without her ever touching the raw data herself. Richard's attorney pushed hard, twice implying she'd used the investigation as cover for a personal vendetta. "Isn't it true," the attorney pressed, "that you personally ordered Mr. Vance released from federal custody within the first hour of recognizing him?" "I raised concerns through my supervising attorney, and a judge signed off on a formal review," Lauren said, level and unhurried. "I didn't order anything. I followed the process, the same as I would for any defendant." "And isn't it also true you dined with Mr. Vance twice during the course of your investigation?" "Once to share findings that were later independently verified. I'm not aware of a rule against eating lunch, counselor." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the gallery. The judge allowed it for a moment before tapping his gavel once. "Ms. Hayes," the judge said finally, removing his glasses, "did you at any point alter, direct, or influence the forensic findings in this case?" "No, Your Honor. I found a discrepancy in an authorization form. I flagged it to independent auditors who confirmed it. Everything that followed came from their findings, not mine." The judge took a 15-minute recess to review the subpoenaed records himself. 15 minutes that felt to Lauren like 15 hours. When he returned, he didn't waste time. "The motion to recuse Prosecutor Hayes is denied. This court finds no evidence of impropriety in the gathering of the forensic record." However, his eyes moved to the defense table. "Counsel is reminded that filing motions for the purpose of generating press coverage, rather than genuine legal grounds, is sanctionable conduct. I'd advise your client choose his next move more carefully." Turned out to be good advice Richard didn't take. Out on bail and awaiting trial, he grew desperate enough to call one of the forensic auditors directly. A soft-spoken man named Dr. Okafor who had spent 30 years building a reputation nobody was going to buy for 6 figures. Richard offered exactly that anyway, framing it as a consulting fee for a revised report that would muddy the timeline just enough to raise reasonable doubt. Dr. Okafor let him finish the entire pitch, thanked him politely, and then played the recording for federal investigators that same afternoon. What had been a wire fraud and embezzlement case now included witness tampering and attempted bribery of a federal official. Charges serious enough that Richard's own attorney sat him down and told him, in plain terms, that a trial was no longer a risk worth taking. He accepted a plea deal 3 weeks after that. 18 years in federal prison, full restitution, and a lifetime ban from any executive financial role. When the judge read the sentence aloud, Richard didn't look at Elijah once. He kept his eyes on the table the entire time. With the case finally closed, Elijah invited Lauren and Maya to a lakeside cabin 2 hours outside the city for the weekend. They arrived Friday evening, and by Saturday morning the cabin smelled like coffee and burnt toast. Elijah insisting he could handle breakfast while Lauren quietly took over the pan before anything actually caught fire. Maya sat cross-legged on the counter, narrating the disaster like a sports commentator. And for a little while it felt like the kind of ordinary morning none of them had been sure they'd get back to. They spent the afternoon on the wooden dock, Elijah failing spectacularly at teaching Maya how to skip stones while Lauren sat wrapped in a blanket, laughing harder than she had in years. "You are terrible at this, Dad," Maya said, watching his third stone sink without a single bounce. "That was a warm-up throw," Elijah insisted, glancing back at Lauren. "Tell her I used to be good at this. I remember you dropping a rock on your own foot in college," Lauren said. "So no, I will not be telling her that." Maya laughed so hard she nearly fell off the dock, and Elijah pretended to be wounded, clutching his chest like she'd broken his heart. That evening, after the sky went purple over the treeline, Maya sat with Lauren on the porch while Elijah made hot chocolate inside. "Can I tell you something?" Maya asked, looking out at the water. "Of course. Ever since my mom died, My dad worked so hard to make sure I never felt like I was missing anything. But he stopped doing things just for himself a long time ago. She turned to look at Lauren. I haven't heard him laugh like that in years. Not until you. Lauren felt her throat tighten. Your dad is a remarkable man, Maya. And so are you, for noticing that. I'm really glad you walked into that courtroom, Maya said, and leaned into her for a hug. Elijah stepped out just in time to catch them like that. 3 mugs balanced carefully in his hands, and stood there a moment longer than he needed to, just watching. What are you two plotting out here? He asked, sitting down beside Lauren and handing out the drinks. Just talking about how bad you are at skipping stones, Maya said, grinning behind her mug. Elijah laughed, pulling Lauren in against his side. She rested her head on his shoulder, listening to the quiet lap of water against the dock, and thought about how strange it was that the worst day of his life had been the thing that finally brought her home. Inside, Maya's laughter drifted out through the screen door as she found something funny on her phone. And somewhere across the lake a loon called once and went quiet. Elijah looked down at Lauren, still tucked against his side, and realized he hadn't thought about the company, the case, or any of the last 3 weeks in almost an hour. For the first time since the raid, that felt less like something he'd survived, and more like something he'd simply gotten to keep. So, Lauren said eventually, tilting her head up at him. What happens now? Now, Elijah said, kissing the top of her head. We stop counting the days since everything went wrong, and start counting the ones since it went right. If the story reminded you that the people who see the real you never really leave, even after 20 years, let us know in the comments, hit subscribe for more stories like this one, and we'll see you in the next video.